Okay, we are live. Just give it one more minute. Okay, you're good to go. Scott, if you want to go ahead and start.
Chris starts.
Oh, Chris, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the second program of our Native American Cultural Celebration for the month of November. This is an annual celebration that we have here in the James Farmer Multicultural Center. My name is Chris Williams, and I'm the Assistant Director of the James Farmer Multicultural Center. And we are pleased to be partnering and collaborating with the James Monroe Museum for the second consecutive year on another program. The next person you'll hear from is the Executive Director of the University of Mary Washington Museums, Mr. Scott Harris. So thank you, Scott, and everyone at James Monroe Museum, Lindsay, Jared, for helping us put this program together again this year. You all are wonderful partners, and I'm really looking forward to hearing the great Dr. King speak this evening. So, Scott.
Chris, thank you very much. It is a pleasure for our staff with the James Monroe Museum to be working with our friends in the Multicultural Center as well. So thank you for that. It is a great pleasure to have our audience with us tonight. We want to thank the sponsors that make all of the James Monroe Museum's programming possible, not only tonight, but throughout the year. Even in the age of COVID, we are still grateful for the sponsorship that we have gotten from the Fredericksburg Charitable Savings Foundation, from the Paul and Jane Jones Trust, the Stuart Jones Charitable Trust that Walter Sheffield is the trustee for, and then also the Friends of the James Monroe Museum, who are our consistent supporters and great value for us. Want to point out that there are two programs coming up from the James Monroe Museum. Next Thursday, the 19th, from 7 to 8:30 p.m. is the 33rd Annual James Monroe Lecture. That will also be a virtual event. The title is Becoming Men of Some Consequence, Youth and Service in the Revolutionary War by renowned author John Rudiman. We'll be looking at how young soldiers and officers who joined the Continental Army during the American Revolution fought and then sought to rejoin society after the war. And then December 4th, we will be having our holiday favorite, Deck the Halls, done a bit differently, Saturday, the 5th of December. Done a little bit differently than in the past. It will also be virtual. Jan Williams will be doing holiday decorations that you'll still be able to see her create and still have a chance to win in a raffle, but it will be done as a virtual presentation. That's from 10 a.m. to noon on Saturday, December 5th. There is a registration required for that. And so if you call the James Monroe Museum at 540-654-1043, you can make that reservation, or go to our Facebook page or website, and that will have information about how to do that. Just a reminder too, as we go forward, Lindsay Crawford, our public programs coordinator, is working the board for us, and she will be passing on to us the questions that we will ask people to do as we go along into the chat boxes of Zoom and Facebook, and then we will deal with those at the end. But Lindsay will be in charge of that. To introduce our speaker, first of two speakers, our principal speaker tonight, Dr. Julia King, and then she will be followed by Jared Kearney from the James Monroe Museum. But Dr. King is a professor of archaeology and anthropology at St. Mary's College of Maryland, where she researches, teaches, and writes about Chesapeake history and culture. Dr. King is a past president of the Society for Historical Archaeology, and from 2003 to 2011, she served as a presidentially appointed expert member on the U.S. Advisory Council for Historic Preservation. In 2018, she received the J.C. Harrington Award from the Society for Historical Archaeology in recognition of her scholarship. And that same year, she received the Archaeological Society of Virginia's Out-of-State Archaeologist Award. So Dr. King, we're glad you're our out-of-state and out-of-sight archaeologist this evening. We look forward to your presentation.
Great, well, thank you very much. And I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and let me know if there are any operator errors, because that can happen very easily with me. Is that good?
You're good.
Okay, great. All right, well, let me get started here. And I want to begin by thanking the James Monroe Museum and Lindsay Crawford, Scott Harris, and Chris Williams for inviting me to talk with you this evening about the work that St. Mary's College of Maryland has been doing in the Rappahannock River Valley since 2015. The James Monroe Museum and Fredericksburg itself, as you all know, are perched on one of the most understudied river valleys in Virginia when it comes to Native history. And if our research is revealing anything, it's a river valley with a particularly important story to tell, one with national significance that hasn't been told yet. I thank all of you who are joining me tonight to hear about this history, and I hope at the end of the presentation, you are as jazzed and as excited about this history as I am. And let's see if this will work. There it goes, yay. My staff and I first became involved with studying Rappahannock history in 2015 when the National Park Service's Chesapeake Bay office, which manages and it's a mouthful, Captain John Smith Chesapeake National Historic Trail, invited us at St. Mary's College to work with them and the Maryland and Virginia tribes to articulate what NPS was describing as the indigenous cultural landscape. This was information that the Park Service could use to educate Americans who came to the trail about the region's Native history. We met Chief Ann Richardson, who is the chief of the Rappahannock tribe, who was especially interested in the potential for archaeology to provide both confirmatory and new information or new evidence about the tribe's long history. So along with Chief Ann and tribal members, we visited landscapes up and down the Rappahannock River in an effort to learn about these places and their meaning to the tribe so that we could pull all of this together for the National Park Service. We also worked with tribal members to map out these places that we were unable to visit, but that were still important to tribal members nonetheless, both in the past, and this is really important, in the present. Park Service also wanted to know about the living tribal spaces. And as we did this, we became increasingly aware of how little archaeological work had been done in the tribe's ancestral homeland. Along with the tribe, we decided to do something about it. Now, before I get into our findings, I want to share this little anecdote with you that suggests just how important history and landscape are and always have been to the tribe. And this is such an intriguing little anecdote that I can never let it go. So I'm going to tell it and get it out of my system. In 1705, English colonist Robert Beverley, who many of you know was Virginia's first historian, described how he and some of his cohorts discovered and then broke in to one of the Tidewater Indians' religious temples, or quioccations, as they were called, on his property near the Rappahannock River in eastern Virginia. Located in a remote forest area, the quioccasin was a loaf-shaped structure, like what you see here, to give you a sort of a visual idea, of posts that were covered with woven mats, not unlike regular native houses, but larger. Beverley found the temple's entrance was barricaded with 14 logs, as in, keep out, and the structure was surrounded by upright wooden posts painted with faces, probably not too different from this scene that was illustrated by John White at Roanoke at the end of the 16th century. Inside the temple, Beverley found decorated tomahawks, a carved wooden figure, which you can see here up on the level next to the bodies, and bundles of human bones that were probably those of deceased leaders. After about an hour with his friends poking around inside this temple, Beverley and his fellows tried to put everything back exactly as they found it, because they knew the natives would be upset if they discovered the Englishmen in such a disrespectful act. Some 300 years later, in 2015, as my staff and I were interviewing Chief Ann, she pointed out Quioccasin Creek. And this is a very narrow creek. You can sort of see it appear and disappear This is down 17 in Essex County. And it meanders for like 3 or 4 miles, and it's not very wide at all through the countryside before it does empty into the Rappahannock River. Now, you know, naming is a big thing for historians. And so this name isn't just like, oh, it sounds great, let's name it. You know, there's something more to this. And this creek happens to run through Blandfield, property that was at the time in the possession of the Beverly family, although this house is significantly later. But it was owned by the father of the builder of this house. Chief Ann further noted that the Baptist church, first attended by tribal members in the early 19th century, today known as the Upper Essex Baptist Church, sits at the head of Quioccasin Creek, perhaps not far from where the temple described by Beverly had been located. And Chief Richardson says, this is not a coincidence. Now, this remarkable example of tribal memory and native place persistence led Chief Ann and me to the question that ultimately would come to frame our research. And basically, what can a study of the Rappahannock River landscape, especially its indigenous landscape, one that draws on archaeology, reveal about the experiences and the geographies of indigenous communities between 10,000 years ago and the present? I'm going to focus on 1500 to 1900 here. How did Native people draw on these shared memories of place and also their indigenous knowledge to fashion new things and new practices, but where this new was often intentionally and creatively building on or incorporating the old, like this idea that they're attending a church, you know, at the head of Quioccasin Creek. And how were these new forms and these practices enacted or performed in the landscape? Now, I'm going to digress a little bit and go to Powhatan territory, because most of us are familiar with Virginia's Native history. We know about the Powhatan Indians. We know a lot about them. I mean, you know, even regular non-historian Virginians are familiar with this history. And Powhatan, shown here on Captain John Smith's map, greeted the Virginia colonists when they arrived in May 1607. And of course, the story of Powhatan's daughter, Pocahontas, is part of our national mythology. It's a real story. I think most literary historians agree that the rescue, for example, is a real story. But Pocahontas is now part of our mythology, not in the sense that it's not real, but that we're all are inculcated about it. Many of you know the famous documentary by Disney, which is a joke. But Zoom loses jokes, I realize. But it is also the case that far fewer people know that on the river just north of Powhatan territory, and I think that you should be able to see my cursor, but here's the Rappahannock River, and you can see here part of the what is called the Pamunkey River. Today it's the, that's actually the Piankatank. This is the Mattaponi, this is the Pamunkey, and they empty into what we today call the York River. So on this river, on the Rappahannock River, which is right here, and it's just north of Powhatan's core territory, there lived even more polities. And you can see all these towns along the north bank of the Rappahannock River. And each one of these towns has its own compelling history and role to play in American history, but we just never hear about them. When in 1608, Captain John Smith visited the Rappahannock River, he generating the earliest surviving written documentation of the Native people living there, he found himself at one point under attack at a place known today as Phones Cliffs. You may know about it. It is a threatened property, to say the least. And here's a image of Phones Cliffs. Smith also found that this less well-known watershed was densely populated, perhaps as much and maybe even more so than the York drainage. If you take the historians and archaeologists' estimates of population, which are very, they're very difficult to make these estimates, the population on the Rappahannock was about 17% larger than that on the York River and the Pamunkey and the Mattaponi. The 8 groups, so this is a pretty densely populated river that people have been ignoring. The 8 groups that Smith observed in the river valley and the events that he described indicate very well organized, successful groups. They were ready to deal with an outsider like Smith and his countrymen. Excuse me while I take a swig of water. Even as they were involved in their own complicated regional politics of conflict and cooperation. This knowledge may have actually spurred the colonists to steer clear of the Rappahannock River, minimizing conflict with the indigenous groups there, who were clearly much bigger in population than where they were. Indeed, English settlement was prevented in the river valley before 1650. And the Rappahannock, located between the more famous Potomac and James Rivers, has been perceived since then as a kind of borderland between the Powhatan and the Potomac River groups. And borderland is not a bad term to use to describe it. Now, these densely settled communities in this river valley presuppose a long and dynamic history in the watershed. These projectile points are ones that we cataloged in a landowner's collection from above Port Royal. And some of these types date back as far as 10,000 years ago. Limited archaeological work undertaken in the Rappahannock watershed indicates that the history of the river valley, while sharing many features with its better known neighbors north and south on the Potomac and then down on New York, appears to have been differed in important ways. The types and differences in distributions of ceramics, for example, suggest that there was rapid population in the Rappahannock Valley relatively late in prehistory. Doesn't mean people weren't here, but the population spurred upwards after about 200 AD. The same evidence revealed that the watershed was a landscape where groups, including from neighboring river drainages, including Maryland and even the Carolinas, mixed more extensively than elsewhere. At least some portions of the Rappahannock Valley may have been mysteriously abandoned about 900 AD, followed by a population boom up and down the river beginning about 1300 AD. After the arrival of Europeans, the Rappahannock groups, while increasingly displaced, resisted complete removal from their homeland. Some of the earliest reservations or preserves for Indian people in colonized North America were created along the Rappahannock, which also became a destination for Native groups pushed out of the Potomac River by colonial encroachment in that region. Now, despite this intriguing history, which is based on very limited evidence, little is actually known archaeologically about the Rappahannock River Valley. This is at least in part due to the relatively undeveloped nature of the river valley, which is something we should celebrate, really. And this is coupled with large tracts of land in both private and public ownership. Some of these tracts go back to the 17th century. They're in the same families. Areas that have been archaeologically surveyed in the Rappahannock are almost non-existent except for Fort A.P. Hill. If you look at this map, and this was our initial core study area, you see the Rappahannock, you can see Fredericksburg up here to the left. And this is Fort A.P. Hill, and Fort A.P. Hill has federal obligations to survey its property. And in fact, you can see that it has, but you can see that very little else has been surveyed along the Rappahannock. We found very limited information about the river valley's archaeological history. Now, this slide shows sites that were mostly reported by Howard McCord, Doug Sanford, who some of you may know, Randy Turner, and Mike Klein. Some of you may know Mike too. Doug and Mike both worked at University of Mary Washington. So as a result of this lack of knowledge, what is known about the Rappahannock Valley natives often is borrowed from what is known about the York and Potomac River nations. So the Rappahannock groups are known by reference to these groups, not in and of themselves. We also found some interesting patterns in the little evidence that we could scare up. By the time that John Smith arrived in the valley, the Rappahannock groups were, as I noted earlier, they were well organized, they were densely populated communities. Smith described 8 polities organized into some 43 towns and hamlets, nearly all of them located on the river valley's north bank. Now in this particular blow up of the Smith map, north is to the right, which is typical for, there's a whole reason why they do this, but it's typical. So we are facing west in this image. The distribution of archaeological sites seems to support Smith's interpretation. So, you know, Smith's looking at it through very English eyes, but we have to trust him to a certain extent. And so the archaeological sites seem to sort of pan that out. For just over a century, this greater concentration of Indian towns on this side, however, has intrigued historians, beginning with this guy, Marshall Howard Seville in 1919, and including many who have interpreted this pattern, including myself, as clear evidence of Powhatan's political dominance, right? Co-locating on the north side of the Potomac, the Rappahannock, the argument goes, allowed the Rappahannock groups to come together and put a safe distance and a river between themselves and their aggressive southern neighbor, Powhatan, who was intent on incorporating them. This was the story that we all told. When I started working with the Rappahannock, I believed it. And I think that the Rappahannock believed it as well. Now, our effort to define and map the Rappahannock landscape found something actually very, very different, suggesting that the Rappahannock group's preference for the river's north bank may have had a very different explanation, and it's not political. Scott Strickland, who works with me, his GIS analysis of a number of data sets found that the north bank of the Rappahannock was attractive to late woodland native people because of the relatively close proximity of desirable ecological resources, including good soils, marshlands, water access, transportation, tributaries, and clays. And by water access, that means that you could go down to the river. For those who may not be familiar with GIS, it stands for Geographic Information Systems Technology. And it is a way of mapping out spatial and geographical information. It's all the in right now. This hotspot image gives a representation of that modeling. So Scott was looking, where were the good soils and where were the marshes and where was the topography that allowed river access? And you can see that while these resources are found on the river's south bank, the shoreline on the south side actually contains a lot of high terraces and steep banks that don't allow easy access to the water. And the resources themselves on the south bank don't always occur in close association. So Smith's report provides confirmation for this interpretation, as he never ever mentions anything about the Rappahannock being afraid of or running from the Powhatan groups. In fact, he notes that the Rappahannock groups use the south side of the river as winter hunting grounds, and that they often join the Powhatan in organized hunts on the south side of the Rappahannock. This really upturns how people have understood the Rappahannock. I've left out the slide that lists all of my colleagues, including myself, who repeat this in their publications. And Smith also just makes no mention of any tension, but he does note that the Rappahannock Indians fought among themselves quite a bit. Now, this is a very important point that I think cannot be stressed enough. For nearly a century, as I noted earlier, archaeologists have understood the Rappahannock Indians as both tributaries of and afraid of the ever powerful Powhatan Indians. It was a model, I told you, that I subscribe to. And it has led, I think, inadvertently to the marginalization of the Rappahannock Indian groups. For almost all researchers, the Rappahannock tribes are simply Powhatan light. This reanalysis strongly indicates that this interpretive model must be thrown out. It forces us to ask questions we haven't asked before, such as the reasoning behind closing the Rappahannock Valley to settlement for 40-some years until 1650. It also forces us to interrogate some of our best sources, the English witnesses who were there and who wrote about the fearsome Powhatans, but said hardly a thing about the Rappahannock. In this new light, with the North Bank hypothesis basically demolished through GIS analysis, I think we can see more clearly how biased the early records are. Of course, we know this, historians know this, right? And you all may know this as well too. But what we may be seeing in these accounts is a contemporary sleight of hand that represents the Powhatan as bigger, badder, and far more scary because there's something in it for the colonists for doing so. Readers in England appreciate the challenges of invading a native homeland and establishing a colony. It is also the case that the colonists lived within Powhatan territory and not in Rappahannock territory. So they're seeing the Powhatan up close in a way that they're not experiencing the Rappahannock. And therefore the Powhatan, of course, loomed larger to them. I think this opens the door to a potential for a major contribution to Virginia's Indigenous history. And if our reinterpretation is correct, and I certainly think that it fits the evidence at least far better than the old model, we have a lot of catch up to do when it comes to documenting Rappahannock Indian history and centering it on its own terms and not simply as a less powerful version of Powhatan history. And this is precisely the point. More data are necessary for the Rappahannock River Valley period. To that end, we secured external funding to begin a fairly major survey of the Rappahannock watershed. For now, that's from Port Conway, just west of the 301 bridge, to Sharps below Warsaw and Tappahannock. The project involves a considerable amount of field surveying, mostly shovel testing. As you can see here, shovel tests are small, 1 foot diameter holes excavated over large areas to give you a sense of the nature of native occupation. To date, and since May of 2018, we have dug 2,550 shovel test pits. People that work for me hate me. And 42 5 by 5 foot test units. And we have cataloged over 100,000 artifacts. Collections-based research is also part of the program. We have spent many days at the Virginia Department of Historic Resources in Richmond looking at collections from the Rappahannock, and we have even crashed the homes of these poor landowners who have allowed us to come look at their collections. This is an impressive pile of native ceramics recovered from Richmond County. This map summarizes all of the properties that we have shovel tested and surveyed to date, as well as collections we have examined. There are gaps. But I will tell you, if you look at this, and I'm hoping that you can see my cursor, you can see where we've looked at some collections. And I think one of these collections was from Ferry Farm. The little squares are where we've done survey, and the X's are where private landowners have showed us what they've collected. I want to note that this was possible in large part thanks to a stellar crew and to assistance from both the University of Mary Washington Field School under the direction of Lauren McMillan and the Fairfield Foundation. Now, a project of this sort requires more than one principal. In addition to St. Mary's College of Maryland, partners included, as noted, the Rappahannock Tribe, the Virginia Department of Historic Resources. So this grant, and I didn't even mention the grant was from the National Endowment for the Humanities. That grant, it was a collaborative grant. We brought together DHR and also the Chesapeake Conservancy, which is very interested in land conservation in the Rappahannock. And while, as I mentioned, while not official partners, both the University of Mary Washington through Lauren and the Fairfield Foundation have been critical to our efforts to collect field data. And because federal funding is involved, that's NEH, we ended up with many informal partners as we were also required to go through the Section 106 process. I know the University of Mary Washington has a historic preservation department, so I figured some of you out there, you poor souls, know about the Section 106 process. And this is the Fed's way of letting everyone know how its funding is going to be used. And these letters had to go out to everybody whose property that we were going to be on. The process took months. And you know, there are some people who don't like to get letters from the federal government. I learned that. It helped to inform landowners of exactly what they could expect, who to appeal to if things weren't going their way, and final disposition of their collections. We also purchased a large umbrella insurance policy naming individual landowners as additional insured. You can tell I sincerely and seriously wanted to get on private property, and I was trying to think of everything that I could do to do that. So what have we found? and what are our next steps? Well, let me give you a few tidbits, and then I'm going to try to bring it closer to Fredericksburg. At Leeds Town, which is located on the north shore of the Rappahannock at a bend in the river, it is a very bendy river, we excavated 136 of our shovel tests. You can see this is the property that we got permission to go on, and each one of these white dots represents a shovel test. We'd love to get over here. I met with the landowner. I never actually got full permission, and because I am a state of Maryland employee, I have to be very careful about where I go. I can't just go and trespass like I did when I was younger. And we also excavated 3 test units, and this is a campground. You may know this campground. We were able to relocate the area where in the early 20th century, a cache of glass beads had been recovered by a farmhand here in this campground. This was like in the 1920s. Caches now, if you don't know what a cache is, it's a deposit that's placed in the earth that contains valuable items, not necessarily valuable in a monetary sense, but valuable in a spiritual sense. Anyone who has studied Leeds Town knows these glass beads. There must have been thousands of them in this reported wooden box that have been buried. They show up in museums from Harvard University to the University of Chicago. DHR has them. The Smithsonian has them. What's interesting about these beads, and there are many interesting things about them, is that they do not show up at all at colonial sites. You don't see them, and these are European beads. These are made in Europe, and so, but they don't show up in Jamestown. They don't show up in St. Mary's City. They don't show up on colonial plantations. They show up here at Leeds Town, but they do show up at native sites, and I am really sorry about this, but this image is not, there it is, okay, there it is. So I take back my sorrow. So on the left, you see Leeds Town, and these beads, both the striped ones and the red and green ones, notice that they show up at Leeds Town in this cache, Port Tobacco in Maryland, which is an Indian site, Heater's Island, which is an Indian site, and check it out. These sites in the interior southeast. That is really cool. This is exciting because these beads connect us to these far-flung places that may initially seem too far away to be meaningful, but these beads suggest that they are not too far away to be meaningful. This allows us to see what I think we've missed about the Rappahannock River. That is that the river valleys function as a borderland that absorbed groups from Maryland, the Carolinas, and elsewhere in Virginia, and that these displaced peoples appear to have been in contact with these faraway communities. Now, I will be the first to say I'm pushing what a bead can tell you, but I am also an archaeologist, and I know that when you have 2 points that make a line, that's a doctoral dissertation, and when you have all these points, that's really important, right? That is really important. And these sites appear to be located along what is known as the Great Indian Trading Path. It also reveals the Rappahannock as a conduit, a route along which deer skins, furs, and Indian slaves flowed east to Atlantic world markets, and European goods, in particular guns, were moved west into this still native interior, and these beads may have gone along those routes. And that's where the beginning of my presentation, you may have seen life at the edge of the shatter zone. The shatter zone is a concept that is not unique to Native America. It's used in many places, but it's gotten some real currency in Native America. It's an idea that this trade radically destabilized indigenous societies, not just in the Tidewater, but in the interior southeast. And that destabilization is also part of that shatter zone. One of the questions that Lindsay Crawford and other staff asked me when we were planning this event was, what could I say about Native history in the Fredericksburg vicinity? This is a really great question, but like the rest of the Rappahannock Valley, archaeology focused on Indigenous history has been limited west of Port Conway. For those of you in the Fredericksburg Fredericksburg vicinity, I ask that you hear our call and help us get into your town. It's an important route into the interior, to these sites, and will no doubt have a great story to tell. In the meantime, let me describe what we have found in the Port Conway, Port Royal region, and I hope it makes you as excited as I am to push our work towards Fredericksburg. I'll begin with the Camden site, the Camden Archaeological Site. It's an archaeological site that was discovered back in the 1960s by Howard McCord. He's a pretty famous avocational archaeologist. He's passed away, but he worked at this site in the 60s. He did actually a really good job. This data is very usable, and you can't always say that about people who dug back in the day. Some of you may know Camden for its amazing Italianate house. This is a National Historic Landmark. But often the property's fields is a somewhat mysterious Indian settlement dated to the second half of the 17th century. The Camden site is characterized by literally thousands of Indian ceramics, way more than you would see at other Indian towns. This is but a small sample, and you can see they're not very decorated. They're low-fired, hand-built ceramics. And I think that Howard McCord, in a very small area, found like 8,000 of these fragments. You just don't see that normally. Indian-made tobacco pipes were also found at Camden. And also found at Camden were these extraordinary Indian badges. These badges were required by a 1662 colonial law that was an attempt to control native mobility. You can see that it says, and that all the said kings give it, and the kings of the Indian groups give it in charge to their people, that none of them presume upon what occasion soever to come within the English bounds without wearing these badges, right? Or else they would be considered enemies. And check out these badges. They're low-grade silver. It looks like this one, maybe the name was wrong. And check this out. I love it. Especially those of you who, used to write do your papers on paper and not in Word. Here's ye king of, and then on the other side, look, they left out the E for Potomac. So they do a little caret and they put the E in. So you King of Potomac. So finding one of these badges would have been an amazing find. Finding two, at least in archaeology, means what the heck is going on? This is at the Camden site. So we decided as part of our project to check out the rest of the neighborhood around Portabago Bay, where Camden is located. We received permission from a landowner to test a site on the south shore of the bay, and we excavated several units there. Same thing, way more Indian ceramic fragments and a lot more Indian, here's some of those Indian ceramics, and also a lot of Indian-made tobacco pipes. And while we did not have any badges, we did have these red and green glass beads, similar to those at Leeds Town, and this extraordinary copper Jesuit ring that probably arrived at the site coming down the great trading path from the French colonies. I don't think it's from Maryland. Maryland did have a Jesuit population, but I don't think that they're linked. I could stand to be corrected, but right now the evidence isn't pointing there. So this is on a site just a little bit away from Camden. Farther upriver, oh, I didn't mention this thing. Check out this this wine bottle base. And this wine bottle base, you can see it's been intentionally flaked as if it's going to be used as a scraper. Wine bottle bases don't break normally like this. Some native person has flaked it to probably use it as a scraper. And this is a really interesting example of a hybrid, a European material, a European object that's been repurposed to native uses. So farther upriver on the other side of Camden, and Camden is in Caroline County, and the site I just with the scraper and the Jesuit ring are in Essex County. Across the river and a little bit farther up in King George County, our attention was directed to a small settlement on a hilltop. This site was not on the river, but inland a half a mile or so. The owner had actually known Howard McCord, so he came and found us and showed us this site on a knoll. So with his permission, we dug 81 shovel tests, there you can see doing our thing, in 2018. And then in 2019, we came back for a week of additional testing. We opened a number of 5 by 5 foot test units, which increases our artifact sample, and finding these strange pits. So you can see we've taken out the overlying, we call it plow zone or topsoil, and you can see that there's some kind of feature that goes down into the subsoil. If you're not an archaeologist, this is subsoil. This is undisturbed, nobody's really bothered it, but something has intruded into the subsoil here. And then we also found this feature. And you can see it's got some, I think is actually the decomposing strap from a barrel. I think that this is a buried barrel. We didn't excavate it because we don't have the resources to excavate it. We need to make sure that when we do excavate it, we have an ethical responsibility to not just rip stuff out of the ground and not have a plan to take care of it. The landowner loaned us his collection, found over the years, including this bridal boss with what is probably an image of William III, and an early flintlock. This is actually probably a mid-17th century flintlock, according to my flintlock expert, Scott Strickland. We are not yet sure who this site on the hillside is associated with, but our sense is that it's a colonial household, very far up the river, living in a neighborhood where displaced natives, including some from Maryland, had located. We do not think that this is a native household, just based on the nature of those features going into the ground. So now we are getting a sense of this neighborhood during the second half of the 17th century. And it doesn't really look like contemporary settlements downriver. We're not finding gobs of Indian ceramics downriver like we are in this neck of the woods, in the Port Royal, Port Conway, Dogue vicinity. And as we did a little exploring, we learned that the Port Royal vicinity, right in the center of this riverine neighborhood, was the limit for seagoing navigation in the Rappahannock. This small fact suggested to us that as seagoing ships anchored in this vicinity, near where Port Royal is today, around the 301 bridge, anticipating furs, deer skins, and slaves from the interior for Atlantic markets, native communities sprung up to provide these services, including pots of corn, Indian-made goods for the journey, and probably even Indian guides to take people into the interior. So when we learned that in this vicinity, there lived a Nanzatico Indian named Edward Gunstocker, we became very excited. You can see from Gunstocker's will that he appears to have been a Christianized Indian. Where is it that, somewhere in here, and of course I saw it earlier, but he is, I resign my soul to God and my body to the earth. This will tells us that he is an Indian. Notice how he says when he writes this will, he's joining the English against his countrymen, the Indians, and he was also a landowner, leaving his 150 acres to his wife, who was also a Nanzatico. He signs the will in 1676, which tells us that he's going off to fight in Bacon's rebellion. So who is this Nanzatico man, this mysterious Nanzatico man with the last name of Gunstocker, who owns land, who is Christianized, and who is located somewhere in our neighborhood, which is the Nanzatico neighborhood of the Rappahannock Valley? We set out to learn more about Gunstocker. Scott Strickland, our GIS maven, who I mentioned earlier, collected the land record, including not only Gunstocker's patent, but those around him, all in an effort to put him on the ground. Previous researchers had placed Gunstocker pretty far west of the 301 bridge, but Scott found that Gunstocker's land was actually located east of the 301 bridge. 301 bridge is off of this map, but it's somewhere up in this area where you can see the cursor. At what might be considered the gateway to Portabago Bay. Now, all we had to do was to alert the landowner and ask permission to test the property to see if Scott's efforts were right. Searching for Gunstocker reveals some of the challenges we have. A lot of the River Valley's most important archaeological sites are located in private hands, and we can only test the sites if the property owner allows us on the land. About 25% don't, which is unfortunate, but we have to take no for an answer. But the person who currently owns the Gunstocker site did want us to come, and she welcomed us to take a look. So one cool September morn, we found ourselves on the Gunstocker property, laying in our grid, anxious to see if Scott's predictions were right. We came back the following day, and much to our excitement, the crew, digging their shovels test, began unearthing native ceramics, white clay tobacco pipes, and English ceramics. All signs are pointing to Ned Gunstocker, and we've applied for funding to return to the site to undertake more intensive testing. By the way, you can see how tiny the artifacts are. There's a scale in the picture. This is no surprise to us as archaeologists because this field has been plowed for probably at least 100 years, and that's going to break stuff up. But just because it's broken up doesn't mean that it's not telegraphing something to us. Here, this is all native ceramics. This is a white tobacco pipe fragment. This is a white tobacco pipe bowl fragment. You can see a nail here. It's kind of hard to see here, but this is a little piece of lead glazed earthenware. You can see a little bit of the lead glaze there. So I'm the first to say that it's not, that this stuff isn't like, you know, it's not artifact porn. I get that. But it's still information. It's still really important. What about Gunstocker's unusual name, a word that the OED says refers to someone who works on guns? Was Gunstocker a craftsman who somehow prepared guns sent from Europe, and he may have modified them for the native market? And what happened to him? Well, we know he didn't die in Bacon's Rebellion because he returned home to ply his trade and to raise corn and livestock. Did his owning the 150 acres become a way for him to prevent being displaced from his land like his other countrymen? Gunstocker met his end when out searching for stray livestock one day, his 2 Indian servants murdered him. His land passed to his wife, as I mentioned, also Nanzatico, and at her death, the land passed to her brother's daughters, a system of inheritance that would have been recognizable to any Virginia Indian. What about west of Port Conway? That is getting to Fredericksburg. We have a travel journal of John Lederer, famous for his explorations of the Appalachian Mountains, who went into the interior via the Rappahannock River, at least on one of his travels. He left from Robert Hollifer's house. Hollifer had come to Virginia by 1647, and he apparently had a house 6 miles west of Port Royal. We've tried to map where it is, and it shows where there looks like there's been a lot of gravel mining, unfortunately. Colonel Catlett was probably also, here's the journal, the third and last expedition from the Falls of Rappahannock River. And you can see he goes in 1670 with Colonel Catlett, and he leaves from Robert Hollifer's house. Catlett actually lived farther down the Rappahannock River. And I need to do a little bit more research on Catlett because Lederer is saying here that they went on August of 1670, but the genealogist pages place Catlett's death in April of 1670. So I have to figure out why there's a disjunction there. But you can see from this narrative that that he's leaving with 9 English horse and 5 Indian guides on foot. I mean, this is, and he's going, they're moving in and they're probably then going to turn south. Lederer even made a map of his travels. And I hope to really drill down, this is where, on this map in the future, especially the Rappahannock part of his travels. Check this out where he says here 6. 6 is a quicksand at the head of Rappahannock River. You all may know what that is. I don't know what it is because I haven't really moved up there yet. In closing, one of the criticisms archaeologists often hear is that we take native history from deep prehistory to contact with Europeans, and then we stop there, just like I've done this afternoon. And I totally acknowledge that. But this is a jazzy story, so I wanted you to hear it. But I want you to remember that story about the Quioccasin and the Upper Essex Baptist Church, and know that our study follows the Rappahannock Indians back down from Indian Neck, their modern homeland, where we are breaking out of that mold. We recently tested the chief's house. It's an abandoned house that the Rappahannock acquired in the 1990s, where 3 20th century Rappahannock chiefs lived beginning about 1920. The chief's house became a critically important location for tribal efforts to resist Virginia's Racial Integrity Act of 1924. A horrible act. If you know it, you know how bad it is. When Virginia law basically said there are no Indians left in Virginia and you can't self-identify anymore as Indian. We have also attested the Samuel Nelson House, where Chief Anne's grandmother was born and raised. Seriously, we have really only gotten started. Speaking of just getting started, we are very interested in extending our survey west towards Fredericksburg. I'm going to be meeting with David Maraca in the coming weeks about Ferry Farm to see what he's been finding at Ferry Farm. As you probably know, there has been quite a bit of gravel mining and land development, and there is no question that the archaeological record is probably damaged. But I also know that archaeological sites survive in New York City. And so I am hopeful that this story of a resilient people from 10,000 years ago to 2020 will eventually be told. I want to thank you again for inviting me to speak with you this evening, and also for your interest in the project. So thank you very much. And should I quit sharing my screen?
Yes, that would be great. Thank you.
All right, great. Thank you all again.
Dr. King, thank you so much. We'll be glad to have you answering questions in a few moments. We want to make a quick segue to sort of a coda, if you will, to Dr. King's presentation, talking a little bit about what the Native American relationships with James Monroe are and some of the artifacts that we have. And there's a closer tie than one might think, because James Monroe was born in Westmoreland County in 1758, really in the heart of some of the areas of the Rappahannock people that Dr. King was talking about. Leeds Town, not far away, Colonial Beach, where he is from. And it was an area that he would know well growing up, and would understand to a degree we can't be totally certain of, that a lot of the history Dr. King was talking about was already more than a century in the past by the time James Monroe is coming on the scene. And it forms part of his understanding of the worldview that he has as a colonial Virginian who would come of age and come into leadership into the revolutionary and early national period of the United States. And there is a continuity here, because an unfortunate, tragic continuity is that from the early history that Dr. King talks about through James Monroe's life and beyond, the frontier of white settlement continues to push west, and the clash of cultures that occurs throughout that period marks so much of our history between white and native peoples that we are still resolving in many ways today. And part of that involved the formal ceremonial contacts between native peoples and the United States government. And just as you saw some of the badges that were recovered in archaeology, Jared Kearney in a moment will be talking a bit about some of the similar types of objects that the James Monroe Museum has that represent the contacts between James Monroe as president from 1817 to 1825 and the native peoples that he encountered in formal settings. I want to go ahead and introduce Jared as he will bring himself back online here. Jared's assistant director and curator of the James Monroe Museum. He joined the staff in 2011. Previously, he was curator of the Woodrow Wilson Presidential Library and Museum in Stanton, which happens to be located right on that Indian Highway that Dr. King showed. Prior to that, Jared was curator of the Rye Historical Society in New York, and he's been director of the Halleckville Museum Farm and Folklife Center on Long Island. He also worked at the Greensboro Historical Museum in North Carolina, which is where he also got his undergraduate and graduate degrees at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro. So Jared, take it away.
Thank you so much. And I hope my video is working here and everyone can hear me. Yep. Thank you so much, Dr. King. I am going to, and Scott, I'm going to just show a couple artifacts here from our collection. And as Scott was saying, just to sort of give a bit of context for them, James Monroe relationship with Native peoples was structured around official visits and policy rather than a personal one. He was a proponent of an overarching governmental policy of education and as he would put it, civilization or civilizing of Native peoples. And I'll read you just a brief section of his first inaugural address, when he said that it is the duty of the nation to provide for the, quote, preservation, improvement, and civilization of Native inhabitants. So you can see where that's sort of going, where he believed in giving, rather than, he wasn't a huge proponent of big forcible removements, but rather amalgamation, if you will, of Native Americans in education and sort of bringing them into civilized society, as he would put it. So given that context, and as Scott was saying, a lot of his capacity in interaction with Native folks was in ceremony and gatherings. In fact, in 1822, there was a large gathering of Pawnee delegation that came to DC, and at the end of the ceremony, excuse me, at the end of the meetings, they held a large ceremony, a large dance ceremony in which 3,000 people attended and watched. And in that context, at the end of it, the Pawnees exchanged gifts, and here is one of them. Hopefully you can see this. So I'll try to get my screen a little bit. Excuse me, just a second. Let's see if I get my screen a little bit larger there. Okay. And let me show you this. This was likely given to Elizabeth Monroe by the Pawnees in 1822, and I'll hold this up here. It's an amazing piece, a Pawnee purse, with beaded purse, if you could see that. And again, this was an official, given in an official capacity, with policy and with government, overarching governmental policy. You can see that it's just a beautiful piece of work there. It's really quite extraordinary. But that was given to Elizabeth Monroe by the Pawnees in 1822. Now, in the same ceremony, they had also, Monroe would give out silver peace medallions in these ceremonies. And what am I talking about when I say silver peace medallions? Well, I'll show you. We actually have a couple here in the museum. And what I'm talking about, okay, let me hold this up so that you can see. Good here. Okay. If you could see this, and I apologize for my mirrored, I believe my screen is mirrored there. I tried to fix that.
No, you're good. It's all right.
It's okay, okay. So peace medals of varied sizes and materials were tokens of good faith presented to the Native chiefs when signing treaties or with the government or sanctioned exploration of Native territories sanctioned by the government. And U.S. Indian service agents and presidents gave medals made of silver to more important chiefs, and then bronze medals were given to delegates of lesser standing within the tribe during these negotiations. And let me turn it to the other side here. And many Native American leaders actually wore these medals strung in leather thongs around their necks. And we actually, I'll pull up another one here. It's kind of interesting. You see that drill? See, they would drill in there and then hang these around their necks. And whereas if I show this again, this one does not have that. So they actually drilled into this one and to hang it around the neck. And the custom of presenting peace medals dates back to colonial times when a portrait of the King of England appeared on the medals. George Washington, of course, was the first U.S. president to have his medal struck with his likeness, though the production became regularized beginning with Jefferson's administration. I actually did a little nerd blow up here so you can see a little bit better. And again, I'm sorry about the reverse here, but it just gives you a better picture of what is actually on the medals here. And so this actually reads James Monroe, President of the USA, 1817. Now on the back, there's this. Show you here, peace and friendship. And these medals, they were created by Moritz First, who was actually born in Bosing, Hungary, and immigrated to the United States in the early 1800s. And I'll pull this up again so you can see. He also created profiles for Monroe, Adams, Jackson, Van Buren. So if you see other medals of this type, you see this sort of a similar kind of style. There we go. So we have it on the back of here and then on the top of here. And so these peace medals were symbols of cooperation. And Monroe was not the first president to hand them out, but he was certainly prolific in handing them out to various Native delegations that would come forth. So that's what I have to show you. Let me show you the Pawnee purse one more time. I'll hold this up so you can see. Just amazing craftsmanship, amazing work given to Elizabeth Monroe in 1822. And then another example of the peace medal. There's an actual one from back in the day. All right, so that is what I have to show you. If
Okay, thank you, Jared.
you're welcome.
I'm going to go over and take over at this point, and open it up to any questions that anyone may have. This could be for Dr. King. This could also be for Jared. So I'm just going to take a second. If anyone wants to put in the Zoom chat, or if anyone wants to put it in the Facebook chat, please do at this time. We'd love to answer any questions that you may have. So I'm just waiting and seeing what we have here. But Dr. Kim, we've got a lot of thank yous from Facebook so far, from everyone saying thank you for everything.
This is Scott. I'll ask a question over the mic while we're seeing if anybody decides to type into the chat for Dr. King. One of the things that I wonder if you've encountered is how consistently, how well of an oral or even written tradition has come down through the Rappahannock tribe, because a number of the tribes in Virginia, and you mentioned the racial exclusion laws, there was a lot of lost history, a lost cultural identity that some of the tribes in Virginia have had a hard time proving when they're seeking state or federal recognition. And how well have the Rappahannock preserved a sense of their own history?
That's actually a great question. I know they're working with, I think he's an alum of your institution, a guy named Woody Walker, where they're trying to, to do an oral history. I mean, people are passing away at an alarming rate that, people have understanding of the 20th century history. However, I will tell you that I am a big believer in oral history. I learned a long time ago that it is a very valuable way to access information. It may not be perfect, but then historical documents are never perfect either. I mean, those Jamestown records are biased. And Chief Ann believes that what we're finding affirms what is in her tribe's oral history. I'll also tell you that the tribe is, and I would say this is also true for the Piscataway that I work for, they're very, very careful about sharing their oral history, because in the past, people have either misused or, it's just been a lot of prejudice and discrimination against Native people. With the Piscataway, I did a lot of ethnographic and oral history work with them a couple years ago, and it was shocking, actually, what they were put through. And I suspect it was probably the same for the Rappahannock. But Chief Ann believes that some of these sites that we're finding, and she will often, when we go and tell her all excited, like a bunch of little kids, what we found, she already has an idea, and it's a good idea. I mean, she has a reasonable idea. So anyway, long answer to a short question, but yes, the oral history is important.
Okay, we have a question from Sherry Black. What is the history of the Indian punch bowl placed by the Rappahannock in Fredericksburg off of Riverside Drive? What was it used for?
I cannot answer that, but maybe when I come to Fredericksburg at some point in my I'll learn, but that is really interesting. I mean, is it metal? Is it ceramic? Is it a rock?
Right. Okay. I don't know. That's an interesting question. Maybe they'll follow up a little bit with more information. Melanie Dickinson asked, do you have volunteers that help at the dig sites?
We do. The pandemic has kind of put a hurting on us. Mm-hmm. We have like a little hardcore older volunteers at St. Mary's College that go with us, but we do try to use, I mean, the work we do is public, right? I mean, we of course we have to always be respectful of tribal issues and, and not sharing things that shouldn't necessarily be shared. But I think both Chief Ann and I and my crew recognize that this is public funding, so we do use volunteers. We can really use volunteers, to help us with artifact cataloging, but most volunteers want to dig. They want to be outside.
Right. Carolyn Parsons asked, did the Powhatan tribes also use Quackasins? I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly.
No, that was a good job. And yes, they did. I mean, a Quackasin was it's a generic name for their temple. So there were a number. There was, I think, a really important one that all natives knew about on the York River. So yeah, it's not just the Rappahannock. It just happened to be that Beverly writes about this, and I suspect there were a lot of people broke into them that didn't write about it.
Great. We have another question from Jason Sellers. Did Chief Ann / others have a sense of what to expect around the Chief's house or the Nelson House sites? I'm wondering if it's an older site they continued to use in the 20th century, if they lived there in the 20th century because it was an important place earlier.
That's also a really good question. And actually that property was not owned by the tribe until the 1990s. Chief Ann's grandfather, who was the chief, and her mother, who ran an apothecary, or her grandmother, the chief's wife, ran an apothecary and an Indian school out of that building, but they rented it. It was built by a white family. And when the white family died, or when the last of the white family died, they actually had to move back to the childhood home. We haven't had as much, I mean, I'd love to do a little bit more work in the Indian Neck area. A lot of that property is owned by logging companies. So what you've got are, if there are sites, they're probably hard to access, and most of the people in that area show up there in the 19th century. At some point, you all may want to ask Scott Strickland, who works with me, to come and talk with you, because he's actually mapped the routes of the Rappahannock and how they move, how they're pushed upriver to Portabago, and then how they're pushed back down. It's actually a great way to approach federal recognition. They're federally recognized now, but you can actually map spatially how these individuals are moving through the landscape. I mean, and it really speaks to their native history. I wish the property did have some deeper time meaning, but it doesn't.
Okay. Jared, someone asked if you could describe a bit of the design that's on the Pawnee purse.
Yes, sure. It's floral in design. Let's see if I can put my glove on here, pull it up again. It's floral in design. So if you could see, sorry about that. Let's get this back up and see that? So we got leaves coming down here, and then it looks like flowers of some kind along these that are blue. So it's blue, green, and then it's got these triangle marks going up along the side and then up here, and then these stripes at the top. So very beautiful design. Yep.
Is there any meaning behind it, or are we not sure?
No, that's a good question. I don't know. I'd love to find out if there was.
I think if Jared, correct me if I'm wrong. This is Scott. The purse and the piece medals are both featured in the James Monroe Museum's page at Google Arts and Culture. Is that correct?
Correct.
Yeah. So I don't know that they call it that anymore, but Google Art and Culture, if you search that, there are a number of things out of the James Monroe Museum, and we have a little more background on both of those items, as well as other things. I'll also mention there's a UMW blog site about the Indian Punch Bowl that if you go search, just do a Google search and look for the page with UMW blogs. It was done back in 2013, actually, or by a 2013 graduate of UMW in the Historic Preservation Department, part of the blogs on the Rappahannock River Heritage Trail. So there's a good bit of information relayed in there about that that artifact, that in-ground artifact.
Dr. King, a lot of people are reaching out on here and bringing up that they have sites that they would love to let you come look on. Do you have any recommendations for how they could reach out and contact you for that? You're muted right now, I'm sorry.
Sorry about that. People can email me at jking, I'll type it in the chat box too.
Okay.
jking@smcm.edu. We're hopeful that we're actually going to get a second phase of funding. Everything moves like a glacier. So if we get a second wave of funding, we'll definitely want to see what people have. If we don't get a second wave of funding, it's kind of tough. We do it's catch as catch can. But I would love to see what people have.
Right. Someone asked Dr. King, where is the Quickawson Creek in relation to the Occupy Creek? I'm so sorry, I'm butchering these names.
Yeah, they're talking about Occupatia Creek.
Yes, sorry. Where's that in relation to Quickawson Creek?
Oh gosh, I think that Quioccasin Creek is south or east of Occupatia Creek. But if you go on Google Maps and type in Quioccasin Creek, it'll come up Quioccasin Creek, North Virginia. Mm-hmm. And you'll be able to see its relationship to the others. It's a very, very tiny creek, which is not surprising. I suspect that it was a hidden creek. I mean, all of this sort of goes into why there's a Quioccasin on it. Native people wouldn't visit a Quioccasin unless they were invited.
Great. Well, I think that's all of our questions that we have at this time. I want to thank you so much on behalf of the James Monroe Museum for you participating tonight and giving us a great presentation. Chris would like to say something real quick. I'll let him go ahead.
Thank you, Lindsay. Dr. King and Jared, that was fabulous. Thank you for sharing your expertise with not only the UMW students, but the Fredericksburg community. I also want to just make a quick announcement. We actually have the honor of having our keynote speaker who's speaking tomorrow night to conclude our Native American cultural celebration, Ms. Sherry Salway Black. She was one of the people who asked a question earlier about the Punch Bowl. So hi, Mrs. Black, and we're excited to have you as our keynote speaker tomorrow night. So I encourage everyone who is attending tonight's program to join us tomorrow. And you can register on our website, which is umw.edu/multicultural. And then we also, next Tuesday, we have our Human Rights Film Series, an Awake documentary called Awake, which focuses on the Dakota Access Pipeline. And that'll be shown next Tuesday at 5 p.m. And you can also register for that event at the same website I just listed, umw.edu/multicultural. Thank you all again. Scott, Jared, Lindsay, it's always a pleasure working with you all. Dr. King, wonderful.
We agree. Thank you so much. I'm going to end the live.